It started with a letter. A plain white envelope taped to my front gate with the HOA's tacky green logo stamped in the corner. I'd seen a few of their notices over the years, mostly trivial things: grass too long, fence too rustic, barn door not community standard. The kind of stuff you laugh at, then toss into the fire pit with last night's mail. But this one was different. This wasn't a warning. It wasn't a fine. This was an eviction notice. Apparently, I was no longer compliant with the visual integrity and harmony of the neighborhood. According to the HOA, my ranch, which had been standing long before the HOA was even formed, was now considered an eyesore. My livestock fencing, vintage windmill, and even the color of my barn, all suddenly in violation. It was laughable, but as I kept reading, my stomach tightened. They were threatening legal action, claiming that I had 30 days to vacate the property if I didn't bring it into compliance. The sheer arrogance of it floored me. This wasn't some cookie-cutter cul-de-sac with identical lawns and matching mailboxes. This was my family's ranch, a piece of land that had been in our hands for generations. A place with real history, real roots, not something painted over with beige, HOA-approved nonsense. Still, they claimed jurisdiction, citing some obscure clause about extended zoning influence and aesthetic governance over adjacent properties. It was a stretch at best, but that didn't stop them. Within days, I started seeing more activity around the property. HOA board members parked outside my front drive, clipboards in hand, taking photos and writing notes like they were building a case. One of them even had the nerve to knock on my door and hand me a printed list of necessary improvements. It was 3 pages long. Paint the barn, remove the livestock fencing, eliminate any non-standard structures, which apparently included the chicken coop my grandfather had built by hand back in the 60s. They wanted me to sanitize the entire property, whitewash it into something it never was. And if I didn't, they'd proceed with legal steps to reclaim the land, in accordance with the community's long-term development vision. What made it all worse was the smug confidence they carried, as if this was just another routine compliance case. As if I'd roll over and hand them the keys out of fear. I knew their type. Suburban tyrants who mistook authority for power, who thought a clipboard and a fake badge made them invincible. They didn't know me. They didn't know the land. And they clearly didn't know what kind of man I was. I started digging. If they wanted a legal battle, I'd be prepared. I pored over the property documents, land use agreements, zoning maps, every scrap of paper I could find. I spoke with attorneys, former board members, even county officials. And the more I looked, the more I realized this wasn't about rules or aesthetics. This was about expansion. The HOA had plans to rezone nearby lots for commercial purposes, and my ranch was the one inconvenient piece of land that didn't fit their blueprint. They wanted me gone because I was in the way. What they didn't expect, though, was that I wasn't just another resident. I was the landowner. Not just of the ranch, but of something far more valuable to them than I ever imagined. While they were busy trying to evict me from the ranch, they forgot to double-check where their own buildings sat. And that's where this whole story took a turn they never saw coming. While the HOA was building its case against me, trying to bully me off my own land, I kept digging. Their threats didn't scare me. They just made me more curious. I'd grown up on that ranch, knew every fence post, every water line, and every trail carved into the hills. But when someone tries to take what's yours, you start looking at things differently. You look for leverage. And that's when I stumbled onto something they never thought I'd check. In a thick stack of old land documents buried in my father's office, I found a lease agreement from nearly 20 years ago. It was a quiet little contract signed and filed away long before the current HOA board even existed. My family had leased a small parcel of our ranch to the county as part of a long-term infrastructure plan, an agreement to allow public use of the lower eastern lot for administrative or civic development. Back then, nobody thought much of it. It was a dusty field near the edge of the property, nothing special. But a few years later, the HOA was formed. And when they decided to build their shiny new headquarters and neatly paved parking lot, Guess where they broke ground? Smack in the middle of that very parcel. The lot my family still legally owned. The lot they were leasing from us. They'd been using our land for years without realizing we still held the rights to it. The contract was still valid, the lease still active, and more importantly, it had never been renewed under the current board. They were occupying that land under outdated terms, and not a single one of them had bothered to check. I double-checked the lease terms just to be sure. It was a 25-year agreement with built-in review periods and a renewal clause every 5 years. The last official renewal was over a decade ago, and it had been rubber-stamped without any negotiation. The payment terms? A laughable $200 a month, a courtesy rate established back when the land was just a forgotten patch of field. But now, that same land had become the HOA's nerve center. It housed their main office, their files, their community records, and all their precious reserve parking spaces. They thought they held power over me because they controlled the neighborhood bylaws. What they didn't realize was I controlled the ground beneath their feet. Literally. At first, I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe they just didn't know. So I attended a board meeting, first time in years, and calmly asked them if they were familiar with the lease agreement on their headquarters land. They looked confused. A few glanced at each other. The HOA president smirked and said, "We own this building." I nodded, then clarified, "You might own the building, but not the land it sits on." That wiped the smile clean off his face. They tried to brush it off, saying they'd look into it. A week went by. No call, no email, no acknowledgement. So I decided to make it official. I sent them a formal notice through my attorney, along with a certified copy of the original lease agreement and a revised rent structure reflecting the land's current market value, plus interest for the years they'd been underpaying. I gave them 30 days to respond, either with payment or a formal evacuation plan. They didn't respond well. The board called an emergency meeting. I wasn't invited, of course, but word spreads fast in a small community. They were scrambling. Suddenly, the people who'd spent weeks trying to throw me off my land were now begging for meetings, asking for renegotiation, trying to delay. I declined. I told them everything would go through legal channels now. It wasn't just about money. It was about principle. They thought they could intimidate me, force me to comply with their ridiculous aesthetic rules, and erase the history of my ranch to fit their plastic idea of a perfect neighborhood. But now the roles had flipped. Now, they were the ones facing eviction from a property they'd built their empire on without ever realizing they didn't own the soil beneath it. After confirming that the HOA had built their headquarters and parking lot on land they didn't technically own, I went through the lease again with sharper eyes. This wasn't just a piece of paper anymore. It was leverage. The terms of the original lease were generous to a fault. My grandfather had practically gifted the land to the county for a token rate, something symbolic just to help with development. But those terms were over a decade old. The lease hadn't been properly renegotiated or updated under the current board, and now that the land was being used as the HOA's operational hub, its value had skyrocketed. The language in the contract was clear. Every 5 years, the lease was subject to renegotiation based on fair market value and land utilization. It also included a clause that allowed the landowner to set new terms if proper notice was given and the board failed to respond in writing. That clause had never been invoked before, until now, so I brought in a land appraiser, an independent, third-party evaluation of the land use and its commercial value in today's market. When I got the report back, I nearly laughed. What they were using for $200 a month was now worth more than 30 times that. Office space, reserve parking, commercial utility access, all sitting on private land they didn't own and had never paid fair market rent for. I had every legal right to revise the lease. But I didn't just want to revise it. I wanted to make a statement. They had tried to evict me, humiliate me, push me off land that had belonged to my family for generations. I wasn't going to just play defense anymore. So I drafted new lease terms through my attorney. The new rent was doubled, not just from the old rate, but from the newly assessed value. It was aggressive, yes, but still within legal bounds. And the best part? The lease now included stricter provisions, late fees, interest penalties, and a 6-month eviction clause if the rent wasn't paid on time. They had 30 days to agree or vacate. I sent the proposal with a formal letter, accompanied by the land appraisal, copies of the original lease, and photos showing the full scope of their construction on my property. The letter was short and direct. I didn't use legal jargon or try to sugarcoat anything. I wanted them to feel the shift in power. 2 days later, I got a call from the HOA board's attorney. He wanted to discuss options. I told him there was nothing to discuss unless they were calling to accept the new lease or surrender the property. He said they needed more time. I told him time wasn't free. That call ended quickly. The board tried to fight back publicly. They issued a newsletter to the community, claiming I was threatening the future of neighborhood services. They painted me as the villain, uncooperative, unreasonable, even greedy. But they didn't share the full story. They didn't tell residents about the eviction threats they had made against me. They didn't admit they had been underpaying for a decade. And they certainly didn't mention that they never had the legal right to build on that land without renegotiating the lease. But I wasn't worried about public opinion. I had the documents. I had the history. And now, I had the leverage. When the 30-day deadline passed without a formal agreement, my attorney sent the final notice. Legally, they were now in breach. Technically, I could begin proceedings to reclaim the land, which meant I could evict them from their office. And with the new rent terms in effect, every day they delayed payment was costing them more. They started calling, emailing, even sending board members to knock on my door. Suddenly the tone had changed. No more threats, no more arrogance, just panic. The same people who treated me like an outlaw were now pleading for an extension, asking for negotiations they once refused to offer me. But the lease didn't lie. The power they thought they had over me was an illusion. Meanwhile, I held the one piece of paper they never bothered to read closely, one that could undo everything they'd built. With the lease now fully in my hands and the legal groundwork laid, I enacted the next step, activating the new rent terms. There was no reason to wait any longer. They had 30 days to respond. They didn't. That meant the revised contract, which they had been served through both certified mail and a direct handoff to their attorney, was now enforceable under the terms of the original agreement. The monthly rent doubled. Actually, more than doubled. Adjusted for the current commercial value of the land and the fact that they had constructed a building and parking lot on it without proper renewal, the new amount was now close to market average, plus back pay and penalties. It wasn't about the money. That was never the point. But the money symbolized something, the fact that they thought they could push me around while squatting on my property. Now, they'd have to feel that pressure where it hurt. The new agreement was airtight, written by my lawyer with clear enforcement mechanisms. It outlined due dates, late fees, default conditions, and a 6-month rolling lease clause that allowed me to terminate the agreement unilaterally if payment was missed more than once in a 6-month period. In other words, I can now evict them on short notice if they slipped up even slightly. At first, there was silence. For days, I heard nothing from the HOA office. Then came the panic. They called emergency meetings. Several board members reached out, trying to schedule a friendly discussion. Suddenly, all smiles and handshakes. But that's not how they handled things when they taped that eviction notice to my gate. Now, they were learning how it felt to have someone else control the terms. I told them all communication would go through my lawyer. That's when the check started coming in, late, sloppy, and clearly reluctant. They sent the first month's new rent, but they disputed the penalties. My lawyer sent them back a firm reminder: pay in full or face eviction. No gray area, no special treatment. And while they eventually sent the full amount, their tone was no longer condescending. It was desperate. These weren't confident enforcers anymore. These were bureaucrats realizing their entire foundation was built on borrowed ground. Word started getting around the neighborhood. People talked. Some thought I was being harsh. Others quietly cheered me on. It didn't matter to me. What mattered was setting a boundary. This wasn't just about one ranch, one land lease, or one arrogant board. This was about years of control, harassment, and double standards. The kind of power the HOA had wielded over residents like a hammer, dictating house paint, mailbox styles, fence heights, and landscaping decisions as if they owned the air everyone breathed. Now they were the ones forced to abide by rules they didn't write. They hated it. The checks continued to come, and every time they arrived, I had them processed with strict documentation. I wanted a paper trail, just like they had kept on me. I even had a financial firm start managing the rent collections because now it wasn't just about getting paid, it was about doing it by the book. Every single penny, every single late fee, recorded, itemized, and filed. If they missed a deadline, I would know by the hour. I also made sure the new rent structure included a tiered increase clause. Every 12 months, the rent would increase by a fixed percentage based on inflation and market adjustment. And yes, that was included in the original lease framework, buried in the fine print they never bothered to read. I didn't make these rules up. I just used the ones already available to me. The balance of power had shifted, and they felt it. They no longer looked at me like some defiant landowner refusing to cooperate. Now, they saw me as a landlord, one with the authority to disrupt their operations, charge them double, and even revoke their access to the very building they held their meetings in. They had once wielded their rule book like a weapon. Now they were flipping through mine, page by page, looking for a way out that didn't exist. And as their rent drained more and more of their budget, they had to start answering to the very residents they had tried to impress by getting rid of me. Because it turns out, raising HOA dues to cover unexpected rent increases doesn't go over well with families already tired of the board's overreach. The rent checks were coming in, reluctantly but consistently, and every dollar that hit my account reminded the HOA who really controlled the land beneath their feet. But rent alone wasn't enough. Their headquarters sat on my property, yes, but so did something else just as valuable to them, their parking lot. That smooth, striped, freshly sealed parking lot with designated board spaces and 2 visitor spots out front. They had paved it across the far corner of my land, a section technically outside the original lease footprint, but still part of my ranch. There was no record of a separate agreement, no lease, no easement, nothing, which meant they were using it completely without permission. So I did what any landowner would do when someone takes what isn't theirs. I blocked it off. Not suddenly, not in the middle of a weekday when people were coming and going. I gave them notice. I marked the boundary with surveyor flags and posted visible signs that read, "Private property, no unauthorized parking." I gave them 72 hours to remove their vehicles and adjust their operations. No tricks, no ambus. Just a clear, legal boundary being enforced on land they had no right to touch. Then, early one Saturday morning, I had a local fencing company come out. They installed a clean, steel-reinforced gate system along the edge of the lot, right where the boundary line ran. It wasn't even the whole parking area, just the part they weren't paying for. I didn't touch the space included in the lease. I respected the contract, but everything beyond that line, that was mine, and now it was off limits. When the board members arrived for their regular Monday meeting, half of them had nowhere to park. They idled in their SUVs, confused and frustrated, calling each other, calling the office, and eventually calling me. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The signs were clear. The fence was legal. I had every right to restrict access to land that was never part of their lease agreement. Within hours, the emails started flying. They accused me of retaliatory behavior, of endangering their ability to serve the community. They even called it a safety issue. My lawyer responded on my behalf, stating the legal boundary lines, referencing the lease terms, and attaching documentation proving that section of the parking lot was not included in any agreement, past or present. If they wanted to use it, they could pay market value for it, separately, with a new contract, new terms, and new monthly fees. They didn't like that answer. Instead, They tried to find a workaround. I saw them having residents park on nearby streets, in front of homes that had nothing to do with the HOA office. I heard about complaints almost immediately. Neighbors irritated by traffic, noise, blocked driveways. The board had created a new problem while trying to avoid solving the original one. And that problem just kept growing. One board member had the audacity to call it harassment, said I was disrupting the functioning of the HOA and targeting them personally. But I wasn't the one who tried to evict someone from land they'd owned for decades. I wasn't the one who paved over private property without permission. They took what wasn't theirs. I simply took it back. The parking lot blockade became a symbol, not just for me, but for the entire neighborhood. It made people pay attention. Residents started showing up to board meetings just to ask questions. Why is the parking lot half closed? Why are our dues going up? What's really going on with the land lease? The board scrambled for answers they didn't have. Transparency had never been their strength, but now they couldn't hide behind policy memos and closed-door decisions. Every move was being watched. Every dollar was being questioned. The fence stayed up. I maintained it, painted it, lit at night. It wasn't some ugly barricade. It was clean, respectful, but firm. It said what words couldn't: that this land has an owner, that history matters, that you don't get to erase people from their homes and expect silence in return. They tried appealing to the county, claiming I was interfering with community infrastructure. The county reviewed the documentation, saw the lease terms, saw the property lines, and sided with me. They had no grounds to force access to private land not covered under a formal agreement. The board tried to act like it was still business as usual, but they were boxed in, figuratively and literally. Their shiny parking lot now had a legal border they couldn't cross without paying a price. The moment the parking lot fence went up, the HOA's tight grip on the community started to slip. For years, they'd ruled with passive-aggressive emails, selectively enforced bylaws, and a sense of untouchable authority. But now, they were the ones boxed in, forced to adapt, explain, and answer to the very people they had taken for granted. And the residents weren't blind to it. They saw the blocked lot, the rushed board meetings, the sudden change in tone from their once overconfident leaders. Word spread fast, and once people realized the board had built their headquarters on land they didn't fully own, the questions started rolling in. At first, the board tried to spin the story. They called it a land use misunderstanding and claimed they were in discussions with the landowner. But they couldn't keep the details hidden for long. Residents started asking how long this so-called misunderstanding had been going on. Why hadn't they been informed? Why were dues going up while the HOA office itself might be under threat of eviction? And most importantly, how could they let this happen in the first place? The more the board tried to bury the issue, the more it bubbled up. I didn't have to make noise. The facts did that for me. A few residents who had been on my side since the beginning started showing up at HOA meetings to speak on my behalf. They reminded the board, publicly, that I hadn't done anything out of bounds, that I'd simply exercised my rights as a landowner, and that I was the one who had been threatened first. One even read the HOA's original eviction notice out loud during a board meeting, pointing out the hypocrisy. The room went silent after that. It wasn't long before cracks formed inside the board itself. One or two members began distancing themselves from the original decision to go after me. They claimed they hadn't fully supported the eviction letter, or that they didn't realize the land the office was on was leased. The blame game began, quietly at first, then more openly. Meeting minutes showed debates, disagreements, even accusations that certain members had acted without a full board vote when the eviction notice was issued. The unity they once flaunted began to fracture under the pressure. Residents started demanding answers. Some requested audits of the HOA's finances. Others began organizing petitions to have certain board members removed. What had once been a quiet, obedient community now had momentum behind it. And I didn't need to lift a finger. They were doing it to themselves. Their arrogance had blinded them. and now the consequences were too big to hide. People who had once feared the HOA now saw them as careless, even incompetent. Amid the unraveling, I received a formal letter. It wasn't another threat. This time, it was an apology, at least the closest thing to one I was likely to get. The letter acknowledged the unfortunate series of events and requested a meeting to renegotiate the lease on more mutually beneficial terms. It was filled with soft language, carefully chosen words meant to de-escalate, but it was clear what it was: a white flag. They wanted out of the corner they'd backed themselves into. I didn't respond right away. I waited, just as they had made me wait when they taped that eviction notice to my gate. They had no parking, a community growing restless, and a legal obligation to keep paying double rent. Letting them sit with that reality for a little while longer seemed fair. Eventually, I agreed to meet, but not in their office. That was still on my land. I invited them to a neutral location, a small community hall nearby. No boardroom dominance, no closed-door whispers. Just a table, open air, and full transparency. They arrived more humbly than I'd ever seen them. No smug smiles, no performative confidence. They were polite, respectful, and quiet. We talked terms, but this time, everything was different. I wasn't just negotiating rent. I was negotiating respect. The tone had shifted completely. They no longer treated me like an obstacle. They treated me like someone they couldn't afford to cross again. Everything they'd done, every notice, every photo they'd taken, every inch of ground they'd tried to seize, had come full circle. The community had seen the whole thing unfold, and it had changed the way people looked at power, property, and the people who think they can control both without consequence.